Morning, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. It's a slightly disjointed experience, but I hope you can all see me. And yeah, it's really great to be here and to have you all here. It's a very chilly day up here in Gauteng. I hope that things are a little warmer for you, wherever you are. So I think we can pretty much get started then. So I'm going to share my screen here. Can everyone see that?
Yes. Do we need to be on mute or not?
Well, I think probably keep yourself on mute as a default setting, but anyone can ask questions whenever you like. So I think just if you want to ask a question, unmute yourself and make some kind of sonic signal, or else just use the hand raising option on Zoom. I'm just checking here. I don't. The hand raising option doesn't immediately appear to me, so perhaps Ryan or Lauren can just give a shout if somebody wants to say something. Okay, so this presentation then is about making music with basically very limited resources. So having no actual physical instruments, or at least no formal instruments, and recording with just a cell phone. It's a bit of an overview of the project. So essentially, the idea here is that you shouldn't have to buy anything. So it's all about just using whatever is available around your house, using found household objects. As I said, recording with a cell phone, using some headphones or even little cell phone earbuds, a computer, optional, they're recommended, and some free software, both on your phone and on the computer. So just a little bit of background about how I came to be embarking on such a project. Basically, during the lockdown, UNISA, where I work, the marketing department at UNISA asked if I came up with this idea that one could create an entire song. Let me just put these on so I don't get any feedback. And let's go. Let's play a few seconds. You can just tell me if you can hear this. Is that audible to everyone?
No, there's no sound.
No sound. Okay. Let's see. Still nothing?
No, Chris.
Okay, let's see. So I'll just play it through my speakers. Hopefully you're not going to get feedback.
If you're using headphones, we won't be able to hear it, so you'll have to unplug your headphones for a sec while it's
I see. So the sound doesn't. Okay, cool. All right. In that case, let's try this. Is that audible? Great. Okay, cool. Here we go. Skip on a little bit. Great, that's just to give you a bit of the flavor. So you could ask why this particular approach. Thank you for the little hand claps there, much appreciated. Obviously one could achieve this using other means like MIDI, for instance. So, you know, why record using these instruments? Well, the thing about MIDI, and before I embark on this, I should say I use MIDI a lot. I'm a big MIDI fan. It's a obviously extremely useful tool. So I'm not suggesting that this is a replacement for MIDI or anything along those lines. As you'll see, I have my trusty MIDI keyboard set up right next to me here. But it's an alternative way of making music, and quite a novel one, I think. So whereas MIDI, you know, you're working with other people's sounds, basically. The sound palette is there provided for you. Recording in this way allows you to create your own sounds. And obviously the sounds that you create will be the sounds specific to your own environment. So it's quite individual to you. So MIDI obviously provides you with a kind of pre-packaged interface. You know, the synthesizer tells you to some degree what you can and can't do, or the sampler for that matter. Whereas with recording, you have a much broader palette of possibilities. So why not real instruments? Okay, well, obviously in the nature of the project, real instruments were a no-no, and that's it had to be things that were widely available to everyone. Real instruments are of course expensive. They're also somewhat overused. We're kind of somewhat obsessed with the same rather small pool of instruments generally, specific to different genres, whether you know, guitar, drums, etc., in a popular music environment, or orchestral instruments, violin, you know, wind instruments, etc. So I think it's nice to have a bit of a change. One could argue even that, you know, these genres have become somewhat exhausted, perhaps, especially in the realm of orchestral music. I think the limits of what one can do with those instruments are possibly already on view. People do still come up with innovative ways of addressing medium. But I think it doesn't do any harm to branch out a bit and expand our palettes of what's available. So why a cell phone? Again, they're ubiquitous. They obviously not necessarily cheap, actually. I mean, one can actually buy for the price of a sort of new model Samsung or an iPhone. You could actually get yourself a fair quality condenser microphone and quite a nice audio interface, which would enable you to record music to a higher quality. Understandably, of course, people have more use for phones generally. Phones do all sorts of other things, and not everyone wants to devote their cash to purely music-related endeavors. But in conjunction with some fairly basic microphone technique, a phone can actually be a very handy recording tool. So the approach, although it started off from a pragmatic point of view, is essentially kind of ideological as well. It provides access to the means of production to anyone who wishes to engage in this process. And it skips the kind of capitalist marketing-driven economy of always feeling like one has to own more gear before one can actually achieve what one wants to achieve. The whole audio industry tends to be geared, if you'll excuse the pun, towards that approach. There's a tendency to feel that unless you have, this new control surface or these new speakers, that you don't have the potential to create music to a sufficiently high standard. So I think we need to break away from that as well. I think it's whatever you can do with your available equipment, basically. And there's so much music that's produced using very high-end equipment that's not really interesting music at all. I think one shouldn't be inhibited by that. Bit of an overview of the process that we're going to look at today. So 5 steps, basically, 5 skills, if you will, to get us to the finished song. So the first step, choosing your objects as your instruments. Second step, setting up some sound treatment. Third step, choosing phone recording apps. Fourth step, creating some usable phone recordings. Fifth step, processing the audio, which you'll probably do on a PC. And that'll bring us to our finished song. So 2 of these are basically mechanical processes. 3 of them are the creative processes where our actual songwriting takes place. So choosing the instruments itself is a creative process, and it'll begin the process of thinking about genre and style. Creating the recordings itself is also a creative process, because it's not just about setting up the recorder. It's about, of course, playing the instruments yourself, which, unless you have someone to hand who's going to do it for you, is pretty much required. And then, of course, processing the audio is also a creative process, because so much of mixing and editing, for that matter, involves aspects of song structure, instrumental arrangement, etc. So let's have a look at our first skill here, choosing effective objects as instruments. By the way, if anyone has any questions at any point, just jump in. So, of all the possible instruments or other objects scattered around your immediate environment, how does one choose what actually makes an effective instrument? Well, various features. Resonance is an important one. Some kind of ability to capture and amplify the sound is useful. So objects that are not resonant, like very solid objects with no resonant capacities, tend not to produce particularly interesting sounds. General character of the sound. Some sounds are not particularly distinctive. Other sounds are very distinctive. Related to that is their sonic associations. So some sounds tend to be quite mundane, whereas others can be quite evocative. I found while doing this recording that some instruments or rather some objects tend to be evocative of particular other instruments from particular cultures, etc. Like I used the pool noodle as a didgeridoo, for instance, which turned out to be surprisingly effective. Pestle and mortar as a bell, etc. So there's many evocative possibilities. There's also very many mundane possibilities. I sometimes do this kind of project with my students, and for some reason, toilets flushing tends to be high on the list of sounds that people like to use. I would describe that as a not particularly evocative sound. Well, I suppose it is evocative, but not necessarily of what one would want to evoke in a piece of music. And then the function within the piece. So basically, you know, how is the sound going to interact? Any sound context, sorry, is always important in terms of how a sound is going to function. So some objects that are not so effective, indistinguishable knocks, or sounds without much color tend to not be very effective. Very soft sounds are not very effective because you need a certain amount of amplitude to capture the sound effectively. Immovable objects are not a great bet because we need to take whatever we're recording into our improvised sound booth. So if the object can't be moved, then you have to record it where it is. You'll either have to set up a booth around it, or put up with the sort of capturing the ambience of the space as well. Objects that are far away don't work. So obviously a cell phone's microphone is not particularly powerful, and I think it follows a cardioid polar pattern as far as I recall. So it has to be pretty close to the source to capture the sound effectively. So things like birds tweeting in trees, thunder tend not to work particularly well. Okay, so the first step then is to brainstorm some potential sounds. So
Just can I ask a question if you don't mind?
Yes, sure, jump in.
In your previous slide, you spoke about close miking.
Yeah.
What's the ideal distance between the object making the sound and the recording device? What would you recommend?
Yeah, sure. So we'll get into that in a little more detail later on, but pretty close, like around 5 to 10 centimeters tends to work best. If the sound is if the object is very loud, and most of these objects probably won't be because they'll be quite small, then you'd have to move back a bit to make sure that you don't get peaking. But yeah, I would say 10 centimeters is probably about ideal. It boils down to trial and error. So, you know, you record the sound, take it to your computer, or listen to it on your phone if you're using just the phone. See how it sounds. If it sounds too distant, you know, if there's too much ambience, in other words, then move the mic a little bit closer. If it's distorting, move the mic further away. So the objects that you encounter basically are going to help you determine the scope and the style and genre of your project, unless you have a specific idea beforehand. What I did when I did my recording was I had very little idea at the beginning of what I was actually going to record. I basically walked around, made a list of sounds, got my 5-year-old in to help as well. She was actually far more creative than I was at coming up with potential sound objects, I found. Made a list of potential sounds and started recording. And as I recorded, I started developing ideas of whether I was creating some sort of, you know, sort of modernist music concrete piece, or whether I was creating something more in the sort of contemporary popular music genre. And as it turned out, I was heading more in the popular music genre. So as you start looking for instruments, it might be useful to have an overview of the different types of ways of making sound, basically. So there's 4, or technically 5, but for our purposes at the moment, we'll stick to 4 different types of instrument classifications, which is according to the Sachs-Horn-Bostel system. So let's have a look at each of these. Question here from Sonia Radame. Thinking about creating a type of sound bank, how would one do this program? Sonia, again, we'll get onto that a little bit later about different ways of approaching your recording, one of which is to create a kind of sample set, essentially, which is one of the approaches I took for instance, when I was creating the melody of that song that I just played you, I created a sample set of wine glass notes by recording each one in turn, and then from then I could simply choose. I put each one on a different track, and then I selected each one as I needed it and copied it into my song. So yeah, that's one way of doing it. Obviously, you could formalize it into a sample set that would work with a program like Contact or Play. I've never actually tried to do that, so I couldn't tell you offhand how to go about that. But I imagine that there must be some kind of probably interface available for doing that. So let's have a look at each of these types of ways of making sound. So first of all, we have our idiophone. So an idiophone is an instrument where the body of the instrument itself resonates or creates the actual sound. So examples here would be an mbira. So the little metal tongs are what actually generate the sound. The wooden plate is there for resonance purposes. A bell, again, it's the actual structure of the instrument, the body of the instrument that makes the sound. Then we have membranophones. So that's basically drum-like instruments. So anything where you have a membrane stretched over a resonating body. So here we have kettle drums as one example, timpani, or a djembe drum as another example. Then we have our chordophones. So anything with a string that vibrates. So there are various ways of setting off a string vibrating. So here we have a piano as one type of chordophone. This instrument in the corner here is a berimbau, which is a Brazilian type of musical bow. Obviously related to African bows, which is where it would have come from. Then we have our aerophones. So aerophones are instruments that sound by being blown. So the example at the top there is the Venda Chicana pipes. You may have heard Venda music. It's basically a dance associated or accompanied by music. Each of these pipes is blown by a separate player. They're not tied together. They look like they're connected there, but actually each pipe is separate. Each player has one pipe and plays at a different pitch. And of course we have our trusty old saxophone. Those are our 4 different types. Then there's also electrophones, but they're not really going to factor into our talk today, but that's sounds produced through electrical means. So I requested that everyone bring 2 or 3 potential instruments that they found around their houses. So would anyone like to volunteer perhaps an instrument that they've brought? Trying to find the hand icon here. I'm still not seeing us. I don't know if anyone's actually trying to communicate, but if you have an instrument, maybe just turn off your mic and give us a shout there.
Roger here. Can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you. Hi, Roger.
Can you see me?
Yes, we can see you.
I've got a bottle.
Great. Yeah. So bottle is a pretty trusty instrument. It's the kind of instrument where you would need to, you could either play it rhythmically or record it just as a once-off, like a single note, for instance. And then you could, for instance, pitch manipulate it using processing. Or else some people actually are able to produce different pitches from one bottle. I've never been able to do that myself, but it is possible. Thanks, Roger. Any other takers?
Hi there. I have a plastic bottle with ridges on it that I'm using a metal straw to make like a sound like this.
Nice. So that's a nice percussion instrument, basically a type of, or similar to the guiro. Yeah, very useful instrument that. I found when doing this recording myself that percussion instruments are probably the easiest to find. There's the most variety out there of them. The hardest ones to find, I found, were melodic instruments. Whereas, yeah, there are plenty of interesting possibilities for percussion. So thanks, Charlene. Any other takers? Hi.
I've got here a ribbon, which I don't know if you should be able to hear it.
Yes.
And then which is cool, as you make it bigger or smaller, you get different frequencies, which is.
That's great. So that's, I suppose that would count as a type of chordophone probably, or maybe an idiophone actually, since the instrument or the body of the instrument itself is making the sound. That's interesting. Probably if you held it in some kind of box, or maybe even attached one end to like a wooden container, it might act as a little resonator for it. Thanks, Jeff. Any other takers? I see Sonia, you look like you're holding something interesting there.
Well, I didn't know about it, but I've actually got, can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so I've just picked up a piece of wood with a rubber band.
Great.
There we go.
Nice. Yeah, rubber bands are they're great instruments actually. I used one on that song that I played you. I created a kind of shamisen type instrument, which is a sort of Japanese guitar type instrument, by putting a rubber band over this cigar box. I don't have a band with me at the moment, but basically by just putting the band around there and plucking it, it created a very interesting guitar-like sound. So here's, yes, I do have some rubber bands actually. Here's an instrument that my 5-year-old created, which is a little box with some elastic bands over it, and by plucking them, if you can hear that, but each one creates a different note. So that I think is a good example of where the creation of the instrument itself gives you some inspiration as to what your final sound is going to be. So yes, Sonia, as you say, it's kind of it's a playful experience basically, which is why I think I found that my child was so effective at helping me out with this, because she's very open to the possibilities of all these objects, and it's good at sort of imagining what they can do.
Chris, you can also use a rubber band like through your mouth.
Right. Yeah, that's great. So then it's kind of a Jew's harp, using the mouth as a resonator. Thanks, Roger. John. Yes, hi.
Hi, it's Niels actually. I don't know why, but I got this. Just a few cents. This is what you can get out of it.
Great. Yeah, and if you put those thanks. And if you put those in some kind of container, either a metal or a wooden container, they'd probably form a very effective shaker.
Yeah. For the rest, what do I got? This, just a small one box with a scissor, with a good drum, I suppose.
Great.
Very monotone though, so.
But quite good resonance. Thanks, Niels. Okay, if that's everyone then, I think we'll move on. And I'll get back to my presentation here.
Chris, I think Peter has a question.
Peter.
I brought a sharpener actually. Yeah, makes quite a nice sound.
That's pretty good. Yeah, that's there is a percussion instrument, a formal percussion instrument.
I was trying to figure out what the name of it is called.
Yes.
I couldn't figure it out.
Right. The closest I can think of is Oliver Messiaen uses this wind machine, which has the same mechanism. Basically, you turn the little crank and it creates this sort of eerie wind noise. Great. So I suppose that would be in terms of instrument classification. What you have there would be what would it be? Probably an idiophone, I suppose. Yeah. All right, let's get back to the screen sharing. I can figure that out. Sorry, having a bit of
The button panel, Chris, the green share screen button.
yeah, okay, thanks. I was on full screen, so I couldn't see that. Right, and there is a slideshow. Share. Okay, cool. Great. So moving on then. Our second skill, setting up our DIY temporary sound treatment. So this was my little sound booth that I created. Basically, as you can see, I just piled up some cushions there to make a little box that I could sit in. So your goals essentially, when you're creating your sound treatment, is to reduce the echoes. So you're only capturing the direct sound from the instrument. Once you start capturing ambience of the room, that changes the sound quite dramatically. Obviously, you know, if you're in a studio situation where you have a nice sound room, then you know, capturing a bit of the room noise can be desirable. But in this situation where we're recording in our own houses with cell phones, capturing room noise is not desirable. So it's best to cancel it out as much as possible by having a sound deadening material. It also helps to reduce the outside ambient noise, so trucks passing by, etc., and you know, just the general hum of everyday life. So is sound treatment really necessary? I think the answer is yes. If you don't have it, then your recording quality tends to plummet considerably, because you have you know, every sound that you record is surrounded by this strong ambience, so you have less control over the actual sonic output. If you just have the direct sound, you can add your own ambience later using reverb or slap delay, etc. So some essentials of your sound booth, got padding on all sides, basically, including the roof. You should have relatively easy access. The first one I made was made out of blankets, and it became very annoying. I had to, every time I climbed out to get another instrument, I had to reassemble the thing. So yeah, something with firm sides is best. Access to electricity so that you can have a light source is good, otherwise you'll be sitting in the dark. And some kind of way of supporting your phone, whether a little tripod or just a pile of books. Not desirable, I think, to have your phone directly on the floor, because then you might end up with reflections from the floor, and also possibly reverberation if your floor is a wooden floor. Which I found was perfectly adequate for the job. It records in M4A audio, which is an uncompressed file format. Other options, there are DAW, which is digital audio workstation programs, available for phones, like N-Track Studio 9 is one example. So preferably an app that can distribute your recorded sound in an uncompressed format. So rather than sending it as an MP3 or recording directly into MP3, it's best if it can be in WAV or M4A or format like that, AIF in the case of Apple, because you want as high quality sounds as possible coming into your DAW. And at that point, it's best to keep the sounds, as high quality until the final mix down. It's useful to have an app for staying in time. So a metronome app, basically. I use this app called Soundbrenner, which is available on both Android and Apple. So then you just have it running on your phone while you record, and you listen to it using headphones. Our fourth skill, the actual recording. Do you have any questions at this point? Trying to get to my chat window if I can. Sonia, yeah, so you need the metronome because once you have some idea about what you're recording, if you're going to record, say, a little loop, like a percussion loop, then it's very helpful if you record that in time. So if you set your tempo on your track as being, say, 80 beats per minute, and you record the thing too fast, or you start at the right tempo, but then you speed up, it makes it very difficult to fit your recording into the song. It's possible, but you have to process the recording quite a bit, and it's better just to record it correctly at the right tempo. It'll save you a lot of time and it'll sound better in the end. Thanks for the reference there, Franco, to John Cage's piece for Amplified Cactus. Sounds very interesting. Okay, if there are no more questions at this point, we'll move on. Okay, so optimize your phone for recording. In whichever program you use, you may find there's an option for recording at different levels of quality. So you should set this to the highest quality possible. As you can see there, in my case, my phone does 256 kilobits per second at 48 kilohertz sample rate. And you have to choose if your phone has this capability, whether you're going to record in mono or in stereo. So for these recordings, I would recommend mono for the most part. Stereo is most appropriate if you're recording an instrument that takes up a fair amount of physical space, like a piano, for instance, or if you want to give the instrument some kind of foregrounding, like for instance, you know, maybe you have a guitar intro on a song and you want the guitar to be foreground at that point, you would have it in stereo, and then later on when the guitar moves to a more accompanimental role, you can move it into mono. But for our purposes, I would recommend just sticking to mono for most of these recordings. So recording technique. So as I mentioned just now in response to Sonia's question, it's best to decide on the song tempo before you make any recordings, or make a few recordings to give yourself a sense of what you're doing, and then decide early on, or as early on as possible, what your tempo is going to be, because that'll enable you to record all your other tracks at that tempo, which will save you a lot of hassle later on. Next step, set up your instrument or object in your recording booth. Locate your microphone on your cell phone. So let me show you. So on mine, it's this tiny little pin-sized hole at the bottom of the phone. Where is it? There. So the microphone is very small on phones. But it's important to know where it is, because you need to actually point the thing towards the sounding object. Configure your phone on a tripod or a pile of books or anything else to support it. As I said, best to keep it off the floor. Point the bottom hole at the sound source around 5 or 10 centimeters away. And try and maintain the same distance, because cell phone microphones are very sensitive. If you move them even slightly further away, then you're going to get a drop in amplitude, and also the frequency response is going to change. If you move too close, you might get a booming, too bassy sound. If you move further away, it's going to start sounding a bit thin. Sorry. As I mentioned, then to record in tempo, you need a metronome app. Feed that to your ears using some little earbuds or any headphones. And then transfer your recording to PC, either by email or USB. So your aims when recording then, first of all, ambience. So you want to capture only the direct sound, no echoes, reverberation, ambience. So just looking at the questions here. Ojo, for this type of work, what would you recommend is a good tempo to work at? Well, that's entirely dependent on the kind of track that you're creating. I mean, obviously slower or medium tempos are easier to perform at, and because it's unlikely that you'll be a specialist on any of these instruments, since we just created the instruments. So probably easier to choose a slightly slower tempo, somewhere in the realm of 80 to 100, 120 BPM. Peter, would it be better to use the earphones mic as opposed to the phone mic? If you use the phone mic, oh yeah, so yeah, you could try that. I've actually never tried recording with earphone mics. I don't know if they'd be higher quality or not than the cell phone. It might be worth a try. Okay, amplitude. So you need to achieve an effective amplitude level. So recording on a phone, the background noise tends to be quite apparent. So you'll probably want to record at a reasonable level. In other words, by capturing more, by having the phone closer to the sound, so you capture more of the instrument, you're going to get a better sound quality, I think, because you'll be able to cancel out some of the background hiss. If the recording distorts, then move the microphone further away. I found on my voice recorder app on my phone, I don't have control over the input level. So the only way I could change the input level was by moving the phone closer or further away. And then tempo, we want to remain in tempo. Like I said, if you change tempo, so if you're not playing to a metronome track, then you're likely to go out of tempo. So it's important to keep the tempo constant. And then it's best to record several takes as well, because you might find you record one take and it's quite good, but or at least you played it well, but the phone was too far away or was distorting. So I find if you jiggle your parameters around a bit while recording to try various possibilities, then it makes the process a little bit easier. Okay, so I touched on this earlier. So the actual method you follow when generating your recordings. So you can either record a sample set, in other words, record each note, if it's a melodic instrument, separately across a range of pitches, and then join those all together in your DAW software. And this is, as I said, the approach I used with the melody I created using wine glasses. So I recorded 2 octaves of wine glasses. Fairly laborious process. Start with a full glass basically, and gradually empty the glass, recording each pitch. I chose to go with a diatonic sound set. So I was in A major and I recorded 7 notes per octave basically. It's up to you, obviously. You know, if you're recording wine glasses at different pitches, you can be as microtonal as you choose. So you know, one doesn't need to stick to the diatonic equal tempered system. For percussion, recording a loop tends to be the best option. So you just record a couple of iterations of the rhythm that you intend to have in your pot. And then you can just loop that in your audio software. You could record each individual notes of a percussion or each individual hit of a percussion instrument, and then manipulate that you know, by cutting and pasting, but that would be pretty laborious, and the rhythm that emerges might not sound particularly natural in the end. Or finally, you can record a part, and this is, I think, definitely the most difficult option here. But I guess if you're going to have a fairly, you know, a piece that doesn't repeat much, is fairly continuous, then you might want to record the whole part. That would obviously involve quite a lot of practice. So yeah, I think I found recording a loop for percussion and recording a sample set for melodic instruments worked best for me. And then, of course, you can combine them all. So a single song is going to have a combination of any number of these possibilities. You don't have to stick to one method for every instrument. So skill 5, some fundamentals of audio processing. Obviously, we don't have space here to go into extreme detail about issues of audio processing. It's a large topic, but just to go into some general concerns. So obviously we're trying to keep it budget free here. So there's no expectation that one would have studio monitors or anything like that. So we're basically dealing with mixing with earphones or headphones. There are pros and cons to doing that. It's usually not advised in you know, mixing circles, obviously not for professional mixing. Well, I say obviously, but actually we'll get to an example of that shortly. There are some issues, especially if you're mixing on tiny little earbuds. You're not going to hear the bass very well, which means that probably when you mix it, you'll tend to have too much bass, with the result that when you play it on a system that does actually play bass properly, the bass is going to be totally overwhelming. Mixing on headphones also tends to overemphasize the stereo field. So things will sound like they're very far left or very far right, which is less the case when you mix on speakers. There are some advantages to mixing with headphones. Specifically, you avoid poor room acoustics. So in our case, where we're not recording, or at least we're not mixing in a treated environment, poor room acoustics is likely to be an issue. So recording on headphones gives you a more direct impression of what the sound is like without interacting with your particular sonic space, which is a definite advantage. Also, if you move from one mixing environment to another and you have the same headphones, then you have more of a reference point than if you start mixing in one room and then go to an entirely different room and listen on different speakers with different room acoustics. So one way of counteracting the issues of the fact that we are not dealing with a premium mixing environment here is simply to audition the track as widely as possible. So in other words, listen to it on as many different systems as you can. So everything from high end, if you have access to studio monitors or a hi-fi system, down to car stereos or a little portable radio or even your trusty earbuds. You want to try and make the recording sound as effective as possible across all those media, which basically is the goal of the specific field of mastering. So mastering engineer's job partly is to try and make sure that whatever listeners listen on, it's going to sound as good as possible. Some computer software possibilities. Personally, I use Reaper a lot. Reaper is a great program. It's a fully functional DAW, digital audio workstation. You can do everything on Reaper pretty much that you could do in a program like Cakewalk or Cubase, etc. It's not technically free, but it does have an unlimited trial period, so you can use it for as long as you want with a full featured version. So yeah, my first choice and my first recommendation would definitely be Reaper. Cakewalk used to be, let's have a little sip of water here. Cakewalk used to be premium software, but is now entirely free. So they actually give you the full version of the program for free. I think all that's lacking is access to some of the VSTs, the Virtual Studio Technology plugins that would ship with the premium version. So Cakewalk is also a great option. Anvil Studio is another possibility, and Audacity. So Audacity is not really a full digital audio workstation, but it is a very capable audio recording and editing program. And all these programs listed here can make use of VSTs. So I'll get to VSTs right now. Henrietta, yes, I'm happy to share the slides with you. I'll send them to Lauren afterwards, perhaps, and she can distribute them. Sonia, which is most user-friendly? Well, I think Audacity is probably the one with the shortest learning curve because it has fewer features. Anvil Studio, I haven't delved into that much, nor Cakewalk, but Reaper I've used a lot, and I find its interface is extremely well designed. It does things with the click of a button or the shift of a mouse that other DAWs make quite heavy weather of. So an example, for instance, is it only has one type of track. So in a program like Pro Tools or Cubase, you have to select if you're going to have an audio track or a MIDI track or an instrument track, whereas in Reaper, you just stick in a track and it can handle any of that, like any of those types of information. You can even have audio and MIDI on the same track. So it's extremely flexible. It kind of, it gives you this interface where you can just do what you want without worrying too much about the complications. So again, I think I'd recommend Reaper on that front. VST plugins. So VST stands for Virtual Studio Technology. So what these are basically are effects devices or instrument devices that interact with your digital audio workstation. So most digital audio workstations come packaged with their own collection of effects or synthesizers, but you can supplement them using VST plugins made by other compressor. Then you'll get lists. There are various sites that give you, sorry about that, lists of possibilities, and then you can just choose the one that works for you. Then editing. So the various editing functions. I don't know how many of you have any familiarity with DAWs at all, but I'll give you a little taste just quickly of the kinds of things that one can do in them. So this is the song that I played for you earlier. So each of these is a little clip, basically, which has some audio in it. Generally, if they look the same, then it means that it's the same instrument, or sometimes the exact same material. Like I think each of these is the same note. So you can do things like, let's just find a good example here that I can cut and paste easily.
Chris, we're still seeing your PowerPoint. I think you should.
Okay. Let's see how I can get onto the song. Yes, okay, I know how to do this. Let's get back into, I need to stop sharing and then share again, don't I? So share screen, song. You see the song now?
Yeah, it's looking good. Thanks, Chris.
Okay, great. So just look at some material here. It's pretty easy. I think this is pretty intuitive stuff, really. So you have a little clip which has some audio material in it. You can, if you press S, it'll split it into two parts. You know, you can move around one part. You can join them up again by clicking on them and clicking glue items. And there's various useful editing functions. Like if you press F2, or if you right click and say item properties, you get onto this screen where you can arrange your fade-ins, or adjust your pitch. So here, adjust pitch in semitones. So if you whack on 5 semitones, it'll go a perfect fourth higher, etc. So like I said, Reaper is an extremely intuitive program. Once you sort of get to grips with its functions, then it's pretty easy to figure out these things. I see we're pretty much over our time, so let me just zip through the last couple of points here. So editing and mixing are the two aspects basically in which you lay out the structure of your project and then arrange the sounds. So there are sort of three. Editing is kind of a three-dimensional process, really. You've got your vertical axis. I suppose you're all still seeing my song still here. I need to switch back to the. Yeah. Okay, so editing, as I say, is kind of a three-dimensional process. You've got your layering of different tracks, which is your y-axis. Your panning, whether you assign things to the left or right stereo field or in the middle, is your x-axis. Then your z-axis is reverb and volume. So that allows you to place things closer or further away to the to where you are, basically, or where the listener is. So if you add more reverb, it'll sound like the sound is further away. If you make the sound, or if you decrease the amplitude of a sound, it'll sound like it's further away as well. So wrapping up then, there are some cultural implications to this process as well of recording, you know, basically found instruments, if you will. So there are probably better models of this than the one I'm showing you. I haven't actually researched this in depth, but signification of culture, I would say, is determined by three aspects, which is the musical material one hears, the performer who's playing the work, the instrument they're playing, and all that is kind of wrapped around who's listening to it. And of course, the listener basically determines their own sense of cultural signification for this. So if you swap out instruments in this group with instruments that have no historical cultural association, then you're kind of messing with this model in potentially interesting ways. So it can be freeing, I guess, in a sense, if you think of like American composers in the 1950s, for instance, who tended to reject the European models of classical composition in favor of their own freer approaches, like is John Cage coming up again. So yeah, I think if you are using your own instruments, then you're creating your own kind of cultural environment in a sense. And you know, then the sense of cultural signification comes from what you choose to put into the material, how you arrange your material, and who you are as a person, which will affect the way people hear whatever your output is, inevitably. So on that note, thanks so much everyone for coming, and if there are any questions, please fire away.
Yes, Chris, it's Roger here.
Roger.
Would it be possible to play? We've got terrible internet connections down here in Cape Town area. Is it?
Yeah.
And I missed the first example of your music. Can you play it again?
I certainly
Thank you.
can. Or else, if you like, I can put the YouTube link in the chat box here, and then
yes, lovely.
YouTube.
Thank you.
Get that link. Let's see. In the meantime, while I do that, any other questions? Okay, and there was another aspect to this as well, which is the option for you to create your own projects and feed them into a work in progress platform, which I think will be available. So if any of you are interested in following this kind of, you know, creating your own project like this, then I would suggest you maybe put together like a one minute piece, and I'm sure Lauren will be able to provide you with the details of how that would be distributed. And if you'd be interested in sending it to me for yeah, I can take a listen and give you some idea of, or give you some feedback on it. I'd be most happy to do that as well. I've just posted in the chat window there the link to the song I played you earlier, so you can have a listen to it in your own time there. There, Lawrence has posted the link. Share with us at Creativate at nationalartsfestival.co.za. One question from Mojo there. I've used F2 to adjust the audio of just one item in a track. Is this the best way to do it in Reaper rather than create a new track? I should say audio volume. Yeah, so you can, of course, manipulate the audio of an entire track just using the track fader. You don't need to create an entirely new track, but you could if you wanted to. Or else, yeah, you can adjust the level of individual tracks. I mean, of individual audio clips. Okay. Great. So if there are no more questions, I think we'll, wait, here's one more question. Charlene. Thanks, Chris. Okay, not a question, just a comment. Great, thanks, Charlene.
Great. And Chris from the festival as well, thank you so much for sharing with us and giving us some insights as to how we can all make music a little bit easier with everything at home. So it's greatly appreciated. Thank you.
It's been a great pleasure. Thanks, Lauren. So shall I sign off, or will you? I think you'll have to sign off on your side.
Yeah, I'll end it now.